Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey, diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Our goal, of course, is to show that everything is figure-outable. Today's guest expert is Michael OBrien. Michael is inspirational speaker on a quest to help 1 million people have their last bad day ever. On July 11th, 2001, Michael had his last bad day when he was struck head on by a speeding SUV while out on a training bike ride. He shares this journey in his best-selling memoir, Shift, Creating a Better Tomorrow. And today he joins us as this week's Modern Leader. Michael, welcome to the show. How are you?
Great. Thank you, sir, for having me on. I'm so excited. This was something I was been looking forward to for several weeks now, so I can't wait to sit down and chat with you.
Well, excellent. Well, we're going to get into your book and ultimately the experience that you had in 2001 that led you to writing the book. But let's start a little bit before that. Prior to 2001, what kind of business, what kind of work were you doing? What was your driving force at that time?
My driving force at the time, I was the marketing director for a pharmaceutical company and responsible for a drug for Alzheimer's disease. And I think my driving force, if we want to get right into it, was I thought I had to follow the script that I learned growing up. Like work hard in high school. I didn't work maybe as hard as I should. Go to college, get out of college, get a gig, meet someone, marry that someone, and work your way up the corporate ladder and just stay on your hamster wheel and grind it out. Sort of the definition or the script of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a professional. And I was sort of doing that, not necessarily having a lot of awareness on how I was doing it. I thought stress was a natural part of corporate America. That's why they pay you, Michael. But the job itself, I loved. It was, I have a sales and marketing background, and I was responsible for my company's flagship drug. So it was a pretty cool job.
Well, you talk about kind of this following this pattern or this idea, traditional idea of, what it meant to be an employee, what it meant to be a husband or a father, a man in society. Do you think that has changed for everybody? Do you think culturally we're changing, or has it just changed with you because of your experience?
I think in some pockets within our culture, it's changing. And as we go through this moment in time, as we go through this whole coronavirus thing, I think we can use this time of disruption to bring about further change, to create a better normal as we continue to pedal forward, if you will. So I certainly see it in certain demographics or generations, maybe with a little bit of a different take on the script of what it means to be a man, or just how we live our professional lives or create a better life. And certainly it did change for me. But there are some folks that are holding on to that old script, that power over mentality at work. Like, I'm in charge, I have hierarchy, I have status, I'm going to tell you what to do, especially during moments of stress that we've all lived through over the last several months. I think we're going to get to a power with, at least that's my hope, a power with mentality in terms of leadership, that we need each other. And I think this experience has shown us that we need each other to get through our challenging times.
Yeah, this idea of power over versus power with, I don't want to make this podcast isn't a political podcast. It's a leadership, a business, a motivational type of podcast. But I can't help but think that, in a lot of things, we're seeing a separation. We're seeing, it's either A or it's B. It's either black or it's white. It seems like we're polarizing, and it almost seems like we're going that way with what you just talked about. Power over on one extreme, power with on the other extreme. And you got a bunch of us here in the middle that are trying to find our way to that power with, because mentally, or actually within our hearts, we feel like that's the right direction. So we're going to get to that and how you apply that today. But take us back now, July 11th, 2001. You get up, you're on your bike. Tell us the story of what happened.
Yeah, so it was a typical offsite meeting. But I'm based in New Jersey, and we went out to New Mexico, north of Albuquerque by about 45 minutes for a traditional offsite back then. Fly in on Monday, fly back on Friday. In between, they would torture you with PowerPoint, and they give you a half day to golf or go to the spa or what have you.
Yeah.
And I decided to bring my bike out because I have this goal of riding my bike in every one of our 50 states. New Mexico had to be crossed off the list. So I was like, this is perfect. Never been. I'm going to bring my bike out. Found this beautiful loop on the hotel property, out the main back road, up the main drag, 2 miles, 10 laps, 20 miles. And then I could go to the meeting like, look what I did, guys.
Yeah.
You guys went to the hotel gym. I went outside and lived New Mexico. And I came around the bend on the fourth lap in a Ford Explorer coming in on the service road to work at the hotel, crossed over into my lane fully in my lane, going about 40 miles an hour based on what the police estimate, and hit me head on. I had nowhere to go. It was a little bit of a blind bend, and it was also a surreal moment. I thought, he certainly sees me. He's going to move. He sees me. He's going to move. He never saw me.
Like time kind of was slow. You had this mental thought. Actually, our minds are so fast that time didn't slow, but you could actually feel, hey, he's going to move. I'm going to be okay. And then not.
And then not. Then it was like, yeah, it was not. And then all of a sudden, and I remember everything about that morning except for maybe 10 minutes. So the sound of me hitting his front grille of the Ford Explorer, the sound I made as I went through the windshield, the screech of his brakes, and then the thud I made when I came to the asphalt below, that of course knocked me unconscious. And then when the EMTs arrived and I was, surrounded by first responders, they totally saved my life.
Yeah.
I asked a question that only another cyclist can totally appreciate. So I know you'll appreciate this one. I was like, how's my bike? And they looked at me like, sir, you got to focus on you. Your bike's fine. And that was my lame attempt of trying to cut the tension of the moment with a little humor, because I could just feel like my life was in question because I was in the worst pain of my life. Just the thought of moving was painful, and just their energy was like, this is dire. They called the helicopter, and when they put me on the helicopter to take me to the trauma center in Albuquerque, I promised myself, if I live, I'm going to stop chasing happiness.
So before we get to stop chasing happiness, I got to ask you. So you're banged up here. I mean, badly injured, in the worst pain of your life. I imagine the EMTs are moving fairly slowly because they don't want to move you. They don't know if you've got broken neck, broken back. They don't know what the injuries are, but they do have to make sure that you're maintain, proper blood pressure and all that. Then they get you on this airplane. What's it like to feel kind of the difference in energy between you, who's in so much pain and want them to just hurry and fix it, and these guys who are professionals that know what they're doing, that are taking their time in a very stressful, tense moment to make sure they do it right?
Yeah, the energy was fascinating. So I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was surrounded by people and police and fire and ambulance, but at the same time, I felt so lonely because they were doing their work and they were, had their professional orientation of like, how do we do it? The ambulance drive was going to be too far. They needed to call the helicopter. But in that moment, I just felt all alone. And I didn't necessarily have clarity as to like what had happened. And I was a little bit out of it. I was,
Sure.
They were trying to protect me from going into shock. They set up a morphine drip, putting me on the backboard to get me onto the stretcher. Took several attempts because like I screamed. It was like almost like an animal caught in a trap. That it was like that primal scream. So I had a couple people who were like sort of right by my head, like trying to walk me through it, but I was having a hard time processing all that, as people can imagine. But that feeling of like, I'm surrounded by people, but I still feel all alone is something I don't think I'll ever forget.
Yeah, and if this had happened in New Jersey, they call your wife, they call your kids, they come by, maybe it takes them 45 minutes, an hour to get there. But you're in Albuquerque. Well, you're actually 45 miles north of Albuquerque. They've got to arrange flights, they've got to get in, they've got to come up to see you. I mean, there was a big delay in time between when your loved ones could be surrounding you.
Yeah, so my daughters at the time were 3.5 years old and 7 months old. And the people at work, so word got to my colleagues at work. And so one of them, my boss basically called my wife and said, "Hey, Michael's been in an accident. You need to come out."
Mm-hmm.
And so keep in mind, 7 months old, she's still nursing our youngest. She's got a busy household.
Yeah.
And she's like, and he didn't know how badly I was hurt. So they're like, "You got to come out." And she's like, "Really? Can't you just like fix him up and send him back home?" And so she's like, "I'm not coming out." And then another person called. And she's like, no, I'm not coming out. And then a third person at my company called that had a lot
More
of stats,
detail. Yeah.
more detail. And she's like, "You need to come out." And she's like, "Well, how long?" "Well, maybe 7 days." And so they set up all the flights. And on the flight back then, you got like, cookies, like nice cookies back in 2001, right? So she's like, "Well, I'll bring out some cookies for Michael, like a chocolate chip macadamia nut cookie. He'll be in recovery by the time I get there. And it'll be A-OK. He'll like the cookies."
Yeah.
She got to Houston because you got to do a connecting flight to Albuquerque. And she calls the ER. I'm still in there. And she's like, "Well, maybe he went in there late. His injuries aren't that bad." She gets to the hotel. She gets to the hospital. I'm still in the OR, still in the trauma room. And she's like, I want to talk to the next person that comes out of that because I want to find out what's going on." And the vascular surgeon came out and said, "Your husband's been in a very bad accident. We did the best we could. The next 72 hours are going to be critical."
Wow.
And she was like, "Oh, he's not going to eat these cookies."
No.
So, and
wow.
it became like, hello, reality.
Yeah.
Up to that point. And in some ways, I'm glad she didn't know the full details because that flight would have been horrific if you knew all those details. The flight couldn't have been fast enough.
Right.
Then our lives got tipped upside down, and we took our first steps towards creating a better normal, which was not linear. It was definitely choppy and messy.
Well, we can tell our listeners to go grab a copy of Shift, and it'll walk through more of the details of the story and kind of all that. But now let's fast forward a little bit because you made a comment. You said, "Look, that was the day I decided I was going to stop chasing happiness." And I think a lot of listeners, including the host of this podcast, feels this desire, this internal drive to chase happiness. Like happiness is some destination we're going to get to. So talk to us a little bit about that mindset shift that happened at that moment.
Yeah, so it was more of an awareness, and I didn't know how to do it though. It's like, okay, it was almost like bargaining, like, "Hey, God, universe, Mother Nature, if you allow me to live, I'll be a better human." Right. And that was some of the things you say, but to yourself in those moments. But up until that moment, I thought, well, my happiness was in that next promotion, or I got that car, or that you got the house, or the meeting would be over, or the project gets released. And the thing is, for all of us, so many of us are on that hamster wheel and we catch it. Like the promotions do happen. The cars come, like the external merit badges, and we feel happy. And then we realize we got to go back to chasing because it sort of vanishes, right? That joy of that moment. And there was something about that moment. I was like, I got to stop chasing and just be. And Zig Ziglar had this quote back in the day of like, do, have, be. I used to learn sales from Zig, listening to his cassettes in my car, my Ford Taurus a day. And I love Zig, and I just love his cadence and his, Southern draw, the whole thing. But he used to talk about how we're doing like hamster wheel stuff to have all the external merit badges, and then we will consider ourselves to be a leader or to be happy. And what he helped me see is that you can flip that script around. Instead of do, have, be, it's be, do, have. You start off with being present, being happy, doing the things that happy people do. And as a result, you can have more of it. So I was listening to his message. I wasn't necessarily practicing it before my accident, but something told me that I needed to make a shift in order to have the type of happiness and let go of some of the stress I was holding on to. Because one big thing I was doing, and I think a lot of us guys do this, is we pack the stress down as we put our body armor on. Like we're all good. Like, we're taught like boys only show certain emotions, maybe a little anger or frustration or irritation, but everything else, pack it down. You got to be the provider, the husband, the leader, what have you. And if you pack it down, eventually it starts building up. And I like to think that SUV knocked all that stuff that was building up out of me, and I got a chance to, do a redo. I had a mulligan, if you will.
Well, we're glad to have you on the podcast, Michael. We are huge fans of Zig Ziglar on this podcast. We quote him all the time. Love his cadence. Love everything about him. And I hear what you're saying in Zig's words, playing the when-then game. I'll be happy when, or when I can do this, then I'll be happy. And you realized at that moment, look, we've got to enjoy this journey. So there's a couple of things that you teach that I want to dive in on right now. But before we dive in on these things, tell us, you come back after this recovery. It takes a little while. Do you go back into marketing, or what happens as you create this Peloton company?
Yeah, so I decided, I had a big aha that I had to get my mind right to get my body right. And I went through a lot of confusion, once I started getting out of the hospital and back on my feet again. I was in the hospital about 3.5 months. And I thought, well, what do you do when you almost die? Do you go to Nepal and go trekking to find yourself? Do you start to, quit your job and work for a nonprofit with more purpose? And I was like, well, those don't seem right. I loved my work.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to my work with a different script, a different way of doing it, that I was more present and not chasing it all the time. So I went back to my job, but on different terms, with a different script. And I definitely credit what I learned through my recovery in helping me get to the executive suite. I don't think I get to the executive suite at my company without this moment. As painful as it was with all that suffering, that helped me shift how I approach my life, but also my career.
Let's unpack that a little bit, because I think there's a lot in there. So you mentioned, I don't think I get to the C-suite without this experience happening. What changed? Because I imagine that, some of us might be thinking, well, okay, now he came back to work. He's working 18-hour days. They can rely on him to do everything. And I don't think that's what you're saying. So what changed that made it so you could get to the C-suite without you working harder necessarily?
Yeah, I got focused on what truly mattered in terms of our work. So my work, as I moved up, and I was the VP of sales and marketing for my company. But one of the big things is I opened up. Before we had Brene Brown in vulnerability, I was like, well, I'm going to express to my team what I was feeling, and not in a too much information type of way, because a lot of times we talk about authenticity and it's like, you're sharing the full Monty. That's not what it is. It's about making a stronger connection about how I was feeling, how I looked at particular things, just trying to be more human, if you will, and having more empathy and helping folks with resilience and courage. So from an emotional perspective, things definitely changed. And since our emotions really do, have the first crack at our experiences and our behaviors, that changed things. So that was the one thing. I also learned how to deal with my stress better. So instead of packing it down, I was able to release it. So instead of getting worked up about these moments, because as leaders, we have these bad moments.
Sure.
But I made a commitment. I don't want to give a bad moment any more fuel than it deserves, because when I get jacked up, I'm not in my sweet spot. So I learned how to let go of things faster, or have them not be so intense, so I could get back to the type of leadership I wanted to demonstrate to my team.
Yeah, and you took away my thunder, because I was going to say you led your way to the top, but you just said that, and I think that that's an important point to point out here, is that as you related with your people, as you became the leader that they were willing to follow, they gave you more people to lead. And that's how you get to the C-suite, is when more people follow you, when you get a group to go in the right direction as a company, well, then they start promoting you. Or, a lot of the listeners of this podcast own their own company, and they're already physically sitting in the leadership chair. But there's more to sitting in that chair than just having the title. And that is this idea, this hard work, this mindset, and this leadership that you had. Now, one of the things you talk about that I think is very fun and unique is this idea of bringing home more than your energy leftovers at the end of the day. Tell us a little bit about energy leftovers and how we can bring home a little bit more.
Well, yeah, so I am not a fan of cold pizza, although many of your listeners might be. What I realized when I was in the hospital, and when you're in the hospital, you have a lot of time to think.
Sure.
It's like when we're going coast to coast at work, and we've gone through this with all this Zooming and teleconferencing, how we feel just tired. That initial phase of Corona during the months of March and April and probably May was this adrenaline rush. And we get to the end of the day and we're toast, we're exhausted. So the only energy we have left is basically our gas tank is on E, or the indicator light is on. So I noticed that in me. I also noticed it in others, that we were spending all this energy at work. We drive home, we go through the front door. Our family wants us too. They want dad, they want mom, and all we could give them was our energy leftovers, the stuff that was picked over. And we would, try to muster through to have dinner, and then back to the couch we go to crank out more emails, before it was time to pour yourself into bed. And so for me, I want, in this moment in time as we go through COVID, but just normal times, just from a corporate perspective and an entrepreneurial perspective, is how do we manage our energy during the day so we can be there for our clients and customers. We can be there for the things that truly matter, but we can also be there for the people who matter most in our lives, which are, our clients and customers, but our partners, our kids, because they want the best of us as well as our business
Well, how do we
colleagues.
do that? Because I'm with you on this, and both you and I do a lot of motivational, inspirational speaking, and I put a lot of passion, a lot of energy into everything I do. We're recording this right now. This is my first call of the day. We started at 7 a.m. my time to get this going. I've got a long day ahead of me, and by the time I get home tonight, 6, 7 o'clock at night, I've put a lot of energy in. So I understand what you're saying, and I want to bring home a full energy tank. How do I do it?
Yeah, so there's a couple different things I recommend to folks. One, it's the way we start our days. So many of us, we sleep next to our phones, and the thing we check once we get up, before we even hit to the restroom for a little bio break, is we check our phones, and then we're off to the races. We check our email, we check our social, and that frames our day in everything that we didn't do as people were sleeping and everything that we need to do. So my recommendation is wake up, set your intentions for the day. How do you want to be? What do you want to do? What do you want to have more of? Pulling from Zig Ziglar again. And just framing out your day so you have priority setting, your intentions are set. Email will be there for you. This only takes like 10 to 15
It'll
minutes.
wait.
It will wait. Believe me, the email can wait. Get yourself some water. Just sort of wake up, get your mind and body connected. That's a great way to start your day. I also have something that I call grabbing a PBR, which is not what you think it is. It's not Pabst Blue Ribbon, but it's pause, breathe, and reflect. That type of PBR. It's a much healthier version of the PBR.
I was thinking professional bull riding.
So yes, so that is one hashtag. So it's not that either. It's not as dangerous as professional bull riding, but taking breaks during the day between our meetings, trying to reshape how we have our meeting cadence out, how long they are, but making sure that they're purposeful, but grabbing a few PBRs. And it's as simple as inhale for a count of 4, hold, exhale for a count of 4, just to slow everything down so we can be more purposeful and thoughtful in what we say and do next.
So
and
what's the R on PBR?
Reflect.
Reflect. So this is huge. I just finished reading Ryan Holiday's book, Stillness is the Key. Don't know if you've picked it up, but it's terrific.
I haven't picked it up, but I know the title, yeah.
It's terrific. And I love this idea. So pause, breathe, and then reflect. Talk to us a little bit about this reflect and why it's so important. I think we get the pause and the breathe. Why reflect?
Well, the reflection piece is how am I doing against those priorities I set in the morning?
Yeah.
And it helps us not get into that reactive mode. When we're in reactive mode, what's happening is the cortisol and adrenaline are firing in our bodies. That's sort of like our old normal. We've been doing it for so long. And when adrenaline's in our system, when the adrenaline sort of washes out, we're left with a little bit of exhaustion.
Yeah, a
We're
dive.
tired. We dive, just
We
like how we
self-medicate with caffeine.
yeah, and then we throw in some caffeine. We might numb it with a little glass, a little Pinot or a little Cabernet, and we do this cycle, and then we don't sleep well. So the R is important to say, okay, I set intentions, priorities for the day. How am I doing? What's in front of me? How do I want to show up? Be really purposeful about that. So we have a game plan. And it's a beautiful way of just sort of like managing our energy throughout the day. And when we get home, before we walk through the door, another good time, just grab a PBR. Think about, okay, I'm going to walk through that door. The people that I spend a whole bunch of time with that want more than my leftovers is looking for mom or dad to bring home something healthy for dinner as an energy. How do I want to show up? How do I want to greet them? Because they want the best of me as well, which I know puts a lot of burden on all of us, but these are the people that are part of our peloton that we need to get through our challenging moments.
I used to have this when we lived in San Jose. Our house had this screw on the outside of the house. We were renting the house, and I don't know what it was, maybe from Christmas lights or something. Somebody had left a screw. And I remember consciously as I would drive in from the office after having spent, 12 hours at the office, like physically taking my mental stresses and the stress of the day and hanging them on that hook, going into the house so that I wouldn't bring that into the house with the family. And then on the way back out the next morning, knowing that I needed to take those with me, grabbing them off that hook. And every time I walked past that hook, I would imagine that's where all my stresses are hanging out right now because my family don't need them.
I love that. And that's a beautiful vision.
All right, before we jump to the final section of the podcast, tell us a little bit about Peloton. Some of us might not be writers. We don't know what this word Peloton means. Tell us about your company, what you're doing, and what this Peloton is.
Yeah, so it's not the Peloton spin bikes. So when I was in the hospital, I came up with this name, Peloton. For those that don't know, a Peloton is a group of cyclists in a bike race. Think the Tour de France, all those different teams, all those different colorful jerseys, all those guys in Lycra that look like peacocks. That's a Peloton. And they need each other to go down the road as fast as possible. They need trust and collaboration and communication. Hey, there's a pothole, turn left, turn right. They're sharing, like drafting. It's this beautiful community, and I use it as a metaphor for our tribes at work, our communities, your personal board of directors, if you will. Like, who are you riding with? Are they bringing out the best in you? And when I was in the hospital, I had about 15 doctors and other healthcare professionals around me. I was dealing with a complication. And after they left, I told my wife, they're like my medical Peloton. They're helping me get down the road, even though they were all on different teams. So I've used it ever since to sort of the spirit of community. Because although we're talking, there's a whole Peloton behind me that helped me get to this point in time. Like, life is not a solo project, nor is our career. And I'm nothing without the people in my life, starting with my wife.
Yeah, and while you and I are the ones sitting here talking on this podcast, by the time our listeners are listening to it, how many hands are going to have touched this from the scheduling and the creating, and then after we do this interview to the editing and the posting and the social media and all of that? We have Pelotons around us all the time. I had this conversation, Michael, as we talk about this just 2 days ago with my daughter. She's 15. We were out on a bike ride, and we were talking about drafting. And we were talking about why in the Tour de France they ride in teams and how some of the team members are not there to win the race. They're there to help the team leader win the race. And they do the drafting so that they can keep them fresh and get speed and, give up their bike if they need to. Like, everybody plays a role on that team. And I thought it was such a beautiful kind of metaphor, something probably that we'll have to bring you back on the podcast and talk about a little bit later. But for right now, as we wrap up our time, we switch gears now to a section I love called Learning from Leaders and ask you just 4 quick questions to find out what you're reading and what you're believing in life. How's that sound?
That sounds like a great plan.
Excellent. All right. So our first question is the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table. What are you reading these days?
So my Leadership Academy, we're diving into mindfulness. So we have the 7 practices of a mindful leader. So I am diving into that.
And how have you found it so far?
I'm on page 1, so we just started.
Literally on your bookshelf today.
Absolutely. It's like the one I'm going to start cracking into this coming weekend.
Yeah, and we've got it on the Modern Leadership bookshelf. We've read it. It's a great book. You'll really enjoy it. And as you go through each of those, I think you'll really grow and learn a lot, and our listeners will too. So, tremendous book. Our second question is your leadership superpower.
Resilience.
Why is that
So,
so important?
and resilience in this way that we often hear, fall down, 7 times, get back up 8. It's about, yes, getting back up, but once you get back up, you've learned something and you've moved maybe in a slightly different direction. Maybe it's only by 1 degree or so. So we as entrepreneurs, as leaders, we're gonna have events that don't hit the mark. We're gonna have some bruises and some scars. And I think they tell a wonderful story. I think to current day, we like to hide our scars and our gray hairs and our wrinkles, and we all have more of them today than say back on March 1st. And I think the more we can show those is like, hey, this is my resilient story, that I've been through a lot. And each time I've gotten back up, I'm a little bit smarter. I'm a little bit wiser, and I'm going to move in a slightly different direction to create the success and change the lives I want to change. So resilience is definitely part of my superpowers.
That is a great perspective as well. I love this idea. We've heard the quote about getting up 8 times when you fall 7, but it's not just about standing back up. It's about learning from what knocked you down and being stronger. And the next time number 8, when you get knocked down, it's something else. And you learn and grow and build. So I love that. Our next question is a motivational philosophy quote or mantra that you live by.
Well, I'll give you 2. One, I learned one of my favorite quotes of all time. I learned from my Little League coach when I was 10 years old. He told me, Ron Brown, Mr. Brown, he said, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And this year has been a tough moment, and the tough got to get going. And so I've always sort of lived by that. And during my recovery, one of my mentors said, hey, Michael, all the events in your life are neutral until you label them. You get to choose the labels. So you get to label yourself in that moment, he said, as a victim, or you can choose a different label and then take different actions. So those 2 have stuck with me all these years.
Excellent. All right. Our final question, sitting up on your bookshelf next to Shift, Creating Better Tomorrows, is the book that you most often gift or recommend. What is it?
Well, I'm showing it to you, The Alchemist.
Yeah.
I know it's LA part. So I'm fond of the color orange. So Shift is orange, this is orange, but The Alchemist is the one that I gift and recommend probably the most. I just love the whole concept of journey and purpose and the story behind it. So this is one of my favorite books.
As a little bit of an aside, Michael, I told you I just finished reading Stillness is the Key by Ryan Holiday. After I finished that, I was so impressed with it that I picked up another book of his called Perennial Seller. And in Perennial Seller, he talks about that book, The Alchemist, and some of the marketing tactics that the author used to get that book into millions of hands. I mean, this book is a massive perennial, if you will, bestseller worldwide. And such a great book, also sitting on our Modern Leadership bookshelf right now. Great book, and I would recommend grabbing that Perennial Seller and just reading that section about how The Alchemist was made so popular. It's very unique, especially from a marketing standpoint.
Oh, that's good. That's an awesome tip. I'm going to pick up both of those books after we get done speaking. I'm going right to Amazon. So
very nice, very nice. Michael, it's been an absolute joy and pleasure to hang out with you today. Before we let you go, where can we find out more about you? Where can we pick up Shift?
Well, it's one-stop discovery. So my website's the best place to start, michaelobrienshift.com. Folks can pick up an autographed copy there. They can also go to Amazon and pick up a copy pretty easy through Prime or what have you.
Excellent. We'll link all that up on the show notes. Thank you for coming on, giving us a little bit of your ride, your journey, your experience, and sharing with us and the Modern Leadership audience. We thank you for it.
Well, thanks for having me on. I hope the audience got a few pearls from our conversation.
Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.